I stood at the kitchen window, my fingers pressed against the faded counter where I had balanced checkbooks for years. Outside, my children raised champagne glasses, their laughter carried by the Arizona breeze. Go rot alone, Mom. We don't need you now. My son's words sliced through me. My daughter's grin sealed it. After raising them, after giving them everything I had, I was nothing but a burden, nothing but a shadow. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Dee stood at the kitchen window, watching the two of them, Kyle and Megan, on the front porch. The late afternoon sun caught the glint of the champagne bottle, which Kyle cracked open with a triumphant twist. He raised his glass, his face lit by a wide, arrogant grin, as he laughed at something Megan said. Their voices drifted toward her through the open window, carried by the dry Arizona breeze. It was their moment, the moment they'd been waiting for. They had just won $40 million, the kind of money that could change anyone's life. And yet, for Dee, it was the moment she realized how far they'd gone, how far they'd already gone from her. She stepped back from the window, pressing a hand to the faded counter where she used to work, where she'd carefully balanced checkbooks and watched the numbers grow smaller over the years. But this was not about numbers. This was about betrayal. Dee's fingers tightened around the edge of her notebook. She had always been proud of her ability to stay calm, to process the facts, to work with the numbers. But right now, in this moment, the hurt was suffocating. She took a slow breath and pushed it down. One more layer of resolve over the hurt. She didn't let them see it. Not yet. Congratulations, she called out, stepping into the doorway with her back straight, her voice even. Kyle didn't even look up as he raised his glass. Megan glanced at her with a flicker of a smile, as though it was all a game, some casual occurrence that didn't require much effort. Go rot alone, Mom. We don't need you now, Kyle said without missing a beat. His voice was sharp, dismissive, as if the mere presence of her in their lives was some kind of annoyance. He didn't even care enough to look her in the eye. He was drunk on something, maybe the money, maybe power. But it didn't matter. Megan's laughter rang out, too loud, too carefree. She raised her glass higher, a wide grin on her face. Finally free, she declared, as if shedding Dee was the best thing they could have ever done. Dee didn't flinch, she didn't react. Instead, she felt a quiet rage simmering beneath her skin, but she swallowed it down. Still, she wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. Not now. Not ever. With a slow, deliberate motion, she nodded, turning her back on them. I'll let you celebrate, she said, her voice soft. There was no anger in her tone, no frustration, only a calm that bordered on unnerving. She closed the door behind her and stepped into the coolness of the house, where silence felt like a balm. Later, when night fell, Rita showed up, as she always did. Dee had expected her. They hadn't spoken on the phone, but somehow, they never needed to. Rita arrived with a knowing look on her face, the kind of look that said she had already seen the ugly truth and was ready to act on it. Rita didn't waste time with pleasantries. She handed Dee a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, crossing her arms over her chest. I saw them earlier. Your kids, she said, her voice thick with disbelief. They think they're invincible now. That money's gonna make them untouchable. Dee took a sip of her coffee, savoring the bitter warmth. She didn't respond immediately. Her mind was elsewhere, turning over the last words Kyle had said, the way Megan had laughed. They think they've won, Rita continued, leaning forward, eyes sharp. But they've just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Let's make them bankrupt instead. Dee's fingers tightened around her cup. We'll have to be smart, she said, her voice low but resolute. I'll need everything in order. I've been waiting for years to do this. I won't make the same mistakes they did. Rita smiled, the curve of her lips telling Dee everything she needed to know. You've always been good with numbers, and now, we'll use them against them. Dee sat back, her mind already spinning the plan. She hadn't said much to them today. She hadn't needed to. They'd already made their choice. And now, she would make hers. As Rita finished her coffee and stood to leave, she placed a hand on Dee's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity. Let them have their champagne for now, she said, her voice soft but laden with promise. Soon, they'll be choking on it. Dee watched Rita walk out into the night, the door clicking shut behind her. The faint glow of the streetlights outside cast long shadows across the room. She wasn't done. Not by a long shot. And soon, they'd see what it felt like to lose everything. Dee stepped into the sleek, minimalist office of Ethan Cole, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a glossy magazine, all glass walls and sharp lines. She adjusted the collar of her blouse, straightening her posture, trying to appear less like the 71-year-old widow she was, and more like someone who knew what she was doing. Ethan had given her a rare, quiet acknowledgement when she'd called for an appointment earlier in the week. He'd said he'd be waiting for her at 2 p.m. sharp, and when she arrived, the waiting room was empty. She had half expected him to dismiss her, maybe to tell her that what she wanted was impossible. But that wasn't Ethan's style. He wasn't the type to send someone away without looking them over first. The door clicked behind her, and Ethan glanced up from a stack of paperwork. His eyes locked on hers with a cool precision that made her feel both seen and scrutinized. He was a man who understood the weight of legal paperwork, of financial ruin, and he understood how to use it. He gestured to the chair across from his polished walnut desk. "Have a seat," he said, his voice calm, measured, like someone preparing for something calculated. Dee could already tell he was going to be the kind of lawyer who didn't flinch when things got dirty. She sat down, still as a statue, her hands resting on her lap, her breathing steady. "I need your help," she began, her voice low but firm. "My children, they've betrayed me. They won the lottery, $40 million, and now they're throwing me out like trash." Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't say a word at first, just let her continue. Dee took a slow breath, gathering the pieces of the pain she'd swallowed earlier, willing it to stay buried deep inside. "They think money will make them untouchable, but they don't understand what's coming. I want you to help me turn their millions into ashes." Ethan's eyes flicked toward the file on his desk, and Dee knew he had already noticed the tremor in her words, the calculation that now thrummed in her chest. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was seeking justice. Just as she thought he might speak, Rita came in without a word, sliding a thick folder onto the desk between them with the ease of a woman who had lived long enough to know how to move unseen. Rita didn't need to be asked. She was always one step ahead, always making things happen before Dee even realized it was time. Ethan opened the folder, scanning the papers inside. His fingers paused on a document, then a smirk tugged at his lips. "Well, this is interesting," he muttered, his voice thick with knowing. "Your children really did think they could get away with this." He turned the papers toward Dee, revealing signatures, Kyle's unmistakably sloppy scrawl, Megan's half-formed loop of a signature. They were the ones who'd signed the jackpot paperwork, all in a rush, not realizing that their haste might come back to haunt them. Ethan's fingers tapped the corner of the file as he looked up, meeting Dee's eyes with an amused glint. "They've already made mistakes, big ones, ones that will be hard to cover up." He slid the papers back into the folder and locked eyes with Dee once again. "I can make sure those mistakes turn into something much more." Dee leaned forward, the subtle weight of her plan beginning to fill her chest, a quiet, controlled fire. "I don't want just the lottery money," she said, her voice steady, cutting through the room. "I want their world to burn. If they think they can throw me away like a rag, I'll make sure they never forget who they left behind." Ethan's smirk deepened. "We'll start with the filings. There are too many discrepancies already. And once we have those in place, we'll build something bigger." "You're right. They think this money makes them invincible. It won't. Not when the right hands are working." Dee nodded, feeling the cool rush of victory flow through her veins. This wasn't just about the money. This wasn't even just about their betrayal. This was about power, her power, their downfall. Her entire life had been spent quietly watching, calculating, balancing numbers. Now, she was going to use those skills to watch their empire crumble. Ethan pulled out his laptop and began typing quickly, his fingers dancing over the keys with the precision of someone who had seen hundreds of financial frauds unfold. Dee watched him, her mind already racing ahead. She knew what came next. She had seen enough to understand how things worked now. It wasn't just about getting even. It was about reclaiming her life, her dignity, and proving that age, family, and even betrayal could never erase what she was capable of. Rita stood at the side, arms crossed, nodding to herself as if already picturing the aftermath. She didn't need to say anything more. It was clear they were in this together. For the first time in years, Dee felt something stirring inside her, something sharper than the hurt they had caused, colder than the void they had left behind. She wasn't going to sit back and let them win. Not when the final card was in her hands, and they wouldn't even see it coming. The room was silent except for the tapping of keys. The beginning of their end had already started. Dee's hand trembled ever so slightly as she opened the envelope, the edges crisp and new, smelling faintly of freshly printed ink. It was another one of those letters, one she had learned to dread over the years, the ones that always came just before something important shifted in her life. This time, though, it wasn't the usual bill or notice from a creditor. This one felt different. As her fingers unfolded the letter, the cold, sharp letters leaped out at her. Loan notice, deed of trust. Her heart skipped a beat. The words on the page were simple, yet they sent a ripple of panic through her. It wasn't just a loan notice, it was a loan taken out in her name. Her house, the modest desert ranch where she'd spent years building a life, had been used as collateral for Megan's so-called business venture. Dee's gaze flicked to the top of the document again. Sure enough, Megan's name was nowhere to be found, but there, in bold letters, was her signature, Deed of Trust. Her pulse raced, but she kept her face still. This was exactly what she had been waiting for. Dee wasn't shocked. She was calculating. Megan, in her impulsive, reckless way, had believed that the house was just another pawn to help her get ahead, to fund whatever wild business she had convinced herself would make her rich. But she didn't know her mother. She didn't understand what a simple mistake like this could cost. Dee set the letter down slowly, her fingers brushing over it one more time. She heard the faint sound of tires crunching on gravel as Rita's car pulled into the driveway. Dee didn't move. There was no need to rush now. The game was in motion, and every piece was falling into place. As Rita entered, she could see the sharp line of Dee's jaw, the quiet fury behind her steady gaze. Rita didn't ask any questions. She already knew what was coming. Without a word, she slid into the chair next to Dee, taking the loan notice and reading it quickly, her eyes narrowing as she absorbed the details. "Looks like Megan's business venture is now your liability," Rita said, with a dry chuckle. She ran her finger over the top of the letter, clicking her tongue in mild disbelief. "She's got the nerve to pull this on you?" Dee didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. Her mind was already working through the next steps. Ethan had already promised to help her tear through the fraud, to find the cracks in the facade that Kyle and Megan had built. And now, this loan on her house, was the crack she needed. Minutes later, Ethan was on the phone with her, his voice a steady anchor on the other end. "We'll void the loan," he said matter-of-factly. "Fraud affidavit is already being filed. You'll be removed from liability immediately." Dee exhaled slowly, feeling a surge of satisfaction, but her face remained impassive. She wasn't done yet. She wouldn't rest until everything they had built was in ruin. The following day, Megan showed up at Dee's house, her face twisted with fury. She stormed in without knocking, throwing open the door so hard it rattled the frame. "Mom!" she screamed, her voice high-pitched and panicked. "What the hell did you do? The loan's gone. They just canceled it. The house was supposed to be my leverage. What did you do?" Dee didn't flinch, didn't budge from where she stood, notebook in hand. Her pen hovered over the page as she began writing, every word precise, controlled. She didn't need to explain herself to Megan anymore. Let her rage, let her scream. "Don't act surprised," Dee said quietly, her voice low and steady. "You used my name for your business venture, Megan, and now you're reaping the consequences." Megan's hands trembled with fury as she looked at Dee, but it was Kyle's voice that carried the real threat. He appeared in the doorway a moment later, his frame blocking the light from outside as he stepped in. His face was red, his nostrils flaring with anger. "You'll regret crossing us, Mom," Kyle snarled, stepping forward. "You have no idea what you're messing with. We'll take everything from you." Dee paused in her writing, glancing up at him for a moment. His words were empty. She had heard them all before, empty threats designed to scare her, to make her feel small. But this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't going to back down. She closed her notebook with a deliberate final motion and looked Kyle directly in the eye. "I'm not afraid of you, Kyle. You've already lost. The only thing left for you to do now is watch it all crumble." Megan's eyes went wide, her hands still twitching at her sides. Kyle stood still, the anger in his eyes barely contained. Dee could feel the weight of the moment. The final thread had been cut. Rita, watching from the doorway, chuckled to herself. "Every thread is just another receipt, isn't it?" she said, her voice almost amused. "They think they're in control, but they're only digging their own grave." Dee stood up slowly, her calm a stark contrast to their fury. She didn't need to say anything more. The battle lines had been drawn. The stakes had been set. Dee's plan was already unfolding, and with every move, it was becoming clearer. It wasn't just about money, it was about taking back what was rightfully hers, and she was just getting started. Ethan's office was quiet as Dee sat across from him, her eyes scanning the screen of his laptop. The steady hum of the machine filled the air, but there was something heavier in the silence between them, a sense of inevitability. Ethan clicked through the pages of documents, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen, his brow furrowed in concentration. "These are the shell companies they've set up," he said, his voice calm but tinged with a quiet disbelief. "They've been hiding income for months, funneling money through dummy corporations. It's textbook tax evasion." Dee leaned in, her gaze fixed on the names of the company. Nothing unusual on the surface, just bland corporate names with generic logos. It was the kind of setup she had seen 1,000 times, the kind of thing that usually flew under the radar. But Kyle and Megan hadn't been careful. They had been reckless, assuming they could cover their tracks with flashy homes, expensive cars, and social media posts that screamed untouchable. They hadn't expected anyone to look deeper. "Classic amateur tax fraud," Rita muttered, standing behind Dee, glancing over her shoulder. She had been quiet all morning, but now a sly smile curved her lips as she read the document. "They were too greedy to hide it properly." Dee's lips barely moved as she spoke, but there was a bite to her words. "I was an accountant. They forgot that." Her hand, steady as ever, reached for the small notebook in her lap, and her pen clicked as she jotted down the names of the company. She didn't need to write everything. She already knew what to do. This was the kind of fight she had been preparing for her entire life. She wasn't just playing the game, she was going to win it. Ethan glanced at her, his expression softening for a moment as he saw the familiar look of focus in Dee's eyes. "I'll file the tip with the IRS," he said, pulling up a form on his laptop. "Once this hits their radar, it'll be impossible to hide." Dee gave a single nod, her mind already turning the wheels of the next move. "Good. Let them feel the pressure. Let them see how easy it is to knock their empire down." As Ethan prepared the paperwork, Dee leaned back in her chair, her thoughts drifting to Kyle and Megan. They thought they had it all. The mansion, the cars, the designer clothes. They flaunted their wealth, oblivious to the fact that they were sitting on a ticking time bomb. Dee could almost picture them now, strutting through their house, acting as if they had won, as if nothing could touch them. Outside, the sun beat down on the Arizona desert, casting long shadows across the driveway as Rita gave a low whistle. Dee looked up, noticing the gleam of her friend's eyes, the satisfaction in her voice. "Kyle's been posting pictures again. Let me guess, another flex on Instagram?" Dee didn't need to see the post to know exactly what it would be. Megan had probably taken another photo of Kyle standing in front of their mansion, arms outstretched, as if the entire world belonged to him. Another picture showing off their wealth, another carefully crafted facade. But it was all an illusion. Dee could see through it. She'd seen it all before. Young, arrogant people thinking they could outrun the consequences of their actions. Rita reached for her phone and swiped through the screen, then showed Dee the picture Kyle had just posted. He was standing in front of their massive, newly built mansion, wearing a custom-tailored suit, the caption blaring, "We're untouchable now." A flash of cold anger flickered across Dee's face, but she didn't let it consume her. She had heard it all before. The arrogance, the sneers, the promises of revenge. But it didn't matter. They had already sealed their fate. "Let them think that," Dee said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "It's only a matter of time before their untouchable world crumbles." Rita smirked, the kind of smile that said she knew exactly what was coming. "And we'll be the ones holding the shovel when it all falls down." Dee's fingers brushed the edge of her notebook, her grip tightening for a moment as she thought about the years she had spent watching her children turn into strangers, watching them drift farther away with each passing day. She had always been the one to support them, the one to provide. But now, They had crossed a line. She wasn't just angry, she was determined. She wasn't going to let them ruin everything she had built, everything she had worked for. The sound of the keyboard clicking brought her back to the present. Ethan was finalizing the paperwork, his eyes flicking between the documents on the screen and Dee's steady expression. "When the IRS gets this tip," he said, "it'll trigger an audit. They won't be able to hide the money trail, and once the IRS freezes their accounts, they'll be forced to sell everything. Everything they've worked so hard to flaunt." Dee nodded, the satisfaction of the plan settling over her like a weight lifting from her shoulders. "Good," she said softly. "Let them feel the walls closing in. Let them realize they're not untouchable. Not anymore." As Ethan sent the file off with a few swift keystrokes, Dee allowed herself a small smile. The war had started, and her children hadn't even realized that the game was already rigged in her favor. Rita leaned in, lowering her voice. "It's all coming apart, Dee, and we're going to make sure they never see it coming." Dee turned toward the window, looking out over the desert landscape as the sun began to dip below the horizon. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. And when the storm hit, there would be no one left standing but her. It started quietly, like a whisper before a storm. Dee sat on the front porch, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the desert, the cool breeze ruffling her hair. She didn't need to check the news, didn't need to hear the radio or read the papers. She knew what was coming. She could feel it in her bones. The game had begun, and there was no turning back for Kyle and Megan now. The phone in her hand buzzed softly, and she glanced at the message. "IRS audit has begun. Their shell accounts are frozen. Game over." Dee smiled faintly, the corners of her lips curling up. She didn't feel the slightest bit of remorse. She had seen this coming from the moment she had set her plan in motion. The wheels were turning, and now it was only a matter of time before everything they had built, all their fake glamour and fraudulent riches, came crashing down. Inside the house, Rita sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee with a gleam in her eye. She didn't need to say anything. The look on Dee's face said it all. Outside, across town, the reality of the audit began to settle in for Kyle and Megan. Megan was in a high-end boutique, her arms full of bags, her credit card swiping without care. She had always loved the thrill of shopping, always wanted more. More shoes, more clothes, more things to flaunt. But this time, as she handed her platinum card to the cashier, the machine buzzed in protest. She frowned, swiping again, more forcefully. The cashier's polite smile faltered. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the cashier said, voice tinged with uncertainty. "Your card's been declined." Megan's fingers trembled as she pulled out another card, this one gold. She tried again. Declined. Her face flushed. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not when she was finally free, finally out of the shadows of Dee's quiet control. She tried a third card, her eyes narrowing with frustration. Again. Declined. The reality sank in with a sickening thud. She wasn't untouchable. She wasn't free. She was exposed. Across town, Kyle sat on the leather couch in his brand new mansion, fuming. He'd been on the phone with his lawyer for the better part of the morning, but nothing seemed to make sense. Their accounts were frozen, their assets seized. The IRS had gone digging, and now there was nothing left. The mansion, the cars, the lifestyle, they were all on the verge of being stripped away. He slammed his fist against the armrest. "This can't be happening," he muttered. "This isn't fair. We played the game right." Megan's panicked voice echoed through the phone line. "Kyle, the cards. They won't work. They've cut us off. I can't even buy coffee." Kyle's eyes flicked toward the massive windows that looked out over the desert expanse. It was supposed to be a symbol of their success, their freedom. But now it felt like a gilded cage. The walls were closing in, and it was Dee. Dee was behind it all. "She's behind this, isn't she?" His voice rose, the rage mounting in his chest. "She's the one who did this. She—" His words were cut off by the slam of the door. Kyle whipped around, his fists clenching at his sides as he saw Dee standing in the doorway, her calm presence like a storm held at bay. Her expression was unreadable. No anger, no triumph, just silence. "You think I'm behind this?" Dee's voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was steel behind every syllable. "You think this is just about me getting revenge on you?" She stepped forward, her eyes meeting his with quiet authority. "You did this. You built this house of lies. I'm just the one who took it down." Kyle opened his mouth to shout, but he couldn't find the words. The truth hung in the air like an inescapable fog. He had been too sure of himself, too arrogant. Now, everything was slipping through his fingers. Dee looked past him, her gaze moving to Megan, who stood frozen by the front door, still clutching her phone. You think money makes you invincible, Dee continued softly. But in the end, it's just paper. It's just numbers on a screen. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. And numbers can be erased. Kyle's face contorted with fury. You'll regret this, he spat, his voice thick with venom. We'll take everything from you, just wait. Dee raised an eyebrow, unruffled. You already have, she said quietly, but you'll never take anything else. Rita, standing just outside, leaned against the frame of the door, arms crossed, her voice cool and knowing. Every threat is just another receipt, isn't it? Dee didn't acknowledge her. Her focus remained on her children, on the wreckage they had caused, the destruction they had unleashed. It was time for them to see what real consequences looked like. Ethan's voice came through Dee's phone, low and steady. The restraining order's been filed. Your assets are secured. They can't touch anything you own. It's all set. The sound of Kyle's fists pounding against the doorframe broke the momentary silence. He was beyond reason now, his anger bubbling over. This isn't over, Dee, he screamed, the words vibrating through the house. We'll make sure you regret every damn thing you did to us. Dee didn't flinch. She didn't even move. Instead, she stood tall, her posture unwavering as she took a slow breath. Her gaze softened, just for a moment as she looked at Rita. They've already lost, Dee said quietly. And as she turned to walk back into the house, the finality of her words echoed through the empty space. Dee sat alone in Ethan's office, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights above breaking the heavy silence that hung between them. Ethan sat across from her, the screen of his laptop casting a pale glow on his face as he scanned through the documents with a quiet intensity. The paperwork in front of him wasn't just another pile of legalese, it was the evidence that would finally tip the scales in her favor. Here it is, Ethan said, his voice cool, but a note of satisfaction slipped through. He clicked the mouse and turned the screen toward Dee. Her eyes narrowed as she saw what he had found. Bank record, meticulously archived, showing clear proof that Kyle had forged Dee's signature to authorize a series of withdrawals from her account. The numbers were crisp, cold, and undeniable. Dee's gaze lingered on the forged signature, the unmistakable sloppiness of Kyle's handwriting. It was almost laughable how poorly he had covered his tracks, how sure he had been that the world wouldn't notice his fraud. A bitter chuckle rose in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She had warned him. She had always known that his arrogance would be his undoing. Ethan leaned back in his chair, folding his hands across his chest. This is exactly what we need, he said. Forgery. It's a felony. He paused, watching Dee carefully. We can file a civil complaint immediately. Kyle will be served with a formal charge before the day is out. Dee's lips parted slightly, her breath slow and steady. The moment she had waited for was here. He prayed for fortune, she said softly, her voice unshakable. Now he can pray for bail. Ethan's gaze sharpened, a hint of approval in his eyes. You're ready for this. Let's finish what we started. Dee didn't flinch. She had spent her life battling numbers, watching as people made one mistake after another. Kyle had made his. He had taken what didn't belong to him, assuming that his entitlement could protect him. But now the truth was out, and there was no hiding behind wealth or arrogance. He had crossed the line, and Dee wasn't about to let him escape. Later that day, the first blow came when Kyle's lawyer called, his voice scrambling and desperate. This can't be happening. It's a misunderstanding, the lawyer said, but there was no conviction in his tone, no confidence. He knew what the bank records meant. He knew what was coming. We'll settle this quietly. There's no need to escalate. Dee's laugh was soft, almost imperceptible, but there was something cold in it. Settle? She said, her voice a quiet promise. The only thing left to settle is how fast this all comes crashing down. Meanwhile, across town, Megan had gone into full damage control mode. Her social media accounts, once filled with glamorous photos of her new life, were suddenly quiet. The flashy posts showing off her mansion, the designer clothes, the extravagant shopping trips, everything had gone dark. The public silence spoke volume. She had distanced herself from Kyle's mess, quickly realizing that the fallout was about to get much worse than she had anticipated. Dee didn't have to wonder what Megan was doing. She knew her daughter well enough. Megan was hiding. She would run as far as she could, retreating into her privileged world, hoping that this whole nightmare would go away. But it wouldn't. Dee was already 2 steps ahead, and Megan's desperate attempts to wash her hands of it only confirmed her guilt. Rita, ever the observer, was the first to speak. She crossed her arms and looked at Dee with a knowing smirk. This is felony fuel," she said, her voice light but laced with satisfaction. "Once this hits, Kyle's done. There's no recovery from this." Dee's eyes were locked on the screen of Ethan's laptop, where the forged checks, the criminal intent, were laid bare for the world to see. She nodded slowly. "He thought he could steal from me, from all of us. Now he's about to learn just how much that costs." The weight of the moment settled on her, but it wasn't enough to stop the fire that burned within her. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. There were still more moves to make, more twists to come. The worst had yet to hit. As she stood to leave the office, Dee couldn't help but think of her children, their shattered illusions. Kyle and Megan had once believed they could outrun the truth, that their money would protect them. But now, they were trapped in a game they didn't understand, and it was her turn to deal the final blow. Ethan's voice followed her as she walked toward the door. "You're ready to take it all back. They've got nowhere left to run." Dee turned toward him, her expression unreadable but resolute. "Now, we finish this." And as she stepped out into the quiet Arizona afternoon, she could already feel the storm rising on the horizon. This was just the beginning of their end. The house stood tall on the horizon, a monument to their greed, their arrogance, but now it was just a shadow of what it had been. The luxury that once radiated from its every polished surface was fading, crumbling under the weight of their lies. Dee stood across the street, her hand resting on the fence, watching as the final pieces of Kyle and Megan's empire were stripped away. The movers had come early in the morning, their trucks already loaded with what little remained of the grand, ostentatious mansion. Outside, the neighbors watched, their phones raised like vultures circling over a carcass, capturing every moment, every piece of their failure. "Lottery losers," one neighbor muttered, loud enough for Dee to hear, his voice dripping with schadenfreude. He wasn't the only one with a camera. The humiliation was complete, the end inevitable. Dee didn't need to be there. She had already won, and the rest was just a formality. She turned and walked slowly back toward her house, her face calm, her mind already turning to the next phase of the plan. It had been a long time coming, but now it was all finally happening. As she reached her front porch, she could hear the unmistakable sound of Kyle's voice, rising above the noise of the commotion at his now former mansion. "You think you've won, Mom?" His voice was raw, filled with rage. "You haven't seen the last of me." Dee didn't react. She could hear his footsteps on the gravel driveway as he stormed across the street, his face contorted with fury, his hands clenched into fists. She had expected this, the anger, the threats, but it didn't faze her. Not anymore. He reached the end of her driveway and stopped, his chest heaving with the exertion of his rage. The cameras were there, capturing every moment. He knew they were rolling. He didn't care. "You took everything from me," he screamed, his words thick with venom. "I'll make sure you regret this. You think I'll let you get away with it?" Dee didn't flinch. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her posture unwavering. Kyle's anger was nothing new. He had always been the same, entitled, vicious, unwilling to see the truth. He thought the world owed him everything, and now that it was all slipping through his fingers, he couldn't handle it. A few of the neighbors had gathered at the end of the street, filming the scene with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. Kyle was making a spectacle of himself, but it was more than that. It was his last desperate grasp at control. The world was watching, and he was being consumed by it. Rita, who had been standing beside Dee, watched the scene unfold with quiet amusement. "Every time he screams, the world laughs," she remarked, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "The more he tries to hold on, the faster he sinks." Dee's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. She didn't have to say anything. The victory was in his rage, in his complete lack of control. The rest of the world was already starting to see what she had known all along. Kyle and Megan were nothing more than fools who had thought they could cheat the system. A moment later, Dee heard Ethan's voice through the phone in her pocket. "I've filed the defamation countersuit," he said, his tone calm and measured, the sounds of a busy office humming in the background. "They won't be able to stop the legal onslaught now. We'll make sure they pay for everything they've done." Dee's gaze drifted back to the scene unfolding across the street. Kyle was still yelling, still trying to regain his dignity, but it was all unraveling around him. The cameras were recording. The world was already turning against him, and in the end, there was nothing he could do to fix it. "Good," Dee said softly, her voice steady and resolute. "Let them keep fighting. It only makes them look weaker." She turned toward the garden, her gaze falling on the flowers she had been tending to earlier in the morning. The peacefulness of the small oasis she had cultivated was a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding across the street. She reached for the watering can, her movements slow and deliberate, her focus entirely on the simple act of caring for the plants that had been a part of her life for years. Behind her, Kyle's yelling faded into the background, no longer a source of stress or anger. It was just noise now. The world had already begun to turn, and Dee knew that soon, the last vestiges of Kyle and Megan's empire would be nothing but a memory, fading like the sun setting over the desert. As the water cascaded over the flowers, Dee's thoughts drifted once more to the future. There was still work to do, more battles to win. But for now, she could breathe, knowing that she had already won the war. The rest was just a formality. And in the quiet of her yard, with the hum of the desert around her, she let the storm rage on. The courtroom was a far cry from the bright lights of Kyle and Megan's former life, but it felt like a fitting stage for what was about to unfold. The gleaming marble floors, the stern faces of the jurors, and the sound of the gavel. Each detail of the room felt like a judgment they couldn't escape. The judge, a man whose years of experience had weathered his face into a mask of indifference, sat at the bench, looking over the papers with quiet authority. Dee watched as Kyle and Megan entered, their presence still as flashy as ever. Megan was dressed in a bright red dress, her heels clicking against the floor with a sharpness that didn't quite fit the situation. Kyle, ever the show-off, wore an expensive suit, the fabric draping over his broad shoulders like a piece of armor. They both walked in like they owned the room, like nothing had changed. But Dee knew better. She knew they were walking into the storm they had created. They both took their seats, Kyle throwing a defiant glance at Dee as he sat, but Dee didn't flinch. She remained steady, her hands folded in her lap, her face calm but full of the quiet determination that had carried her through this entire ordeal. This was her moment. Ethan rose from his seat, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the panic and arrogance radiating from Kyle and Megan. He walked toward the judge with the confidence of someone who had seen the worst of human greed and was about to make it pay. His voice, when it came, was steady and precise as he laid out the facts. "We have irrefutable evidence," Ethan began, his eyes flicking between the judge and the opposing counsel. "Bank records, forged checks, and fraudulent loans, all traceable directly to the defendant." He placed the documents before the judge, one by one, each piece of evidence revealing just how deep Kyle and Megan had gone to hide their wrongdoing. Dee watched as the judge flipped through the papers, his brow furrowing slightly with each new revelation. The forged checks were bad enough, but the loan fraud, using Dee's name without permission to secure a loan against her property, was the nail in their coffin. Dee couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction as the truth unfolded before her. They hadn't just lied, they had stolen. They had crossed a line they couldn't come back from. Kyle, sitting rigid in his seat, clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists on the table. Megan, on the other hand, was growing increasingly pale, her eyes darting nervously from one side of the courtroom to the other. They both knew what was coming, but neither of them could stop it. Ethan didn't flinch as he continued, breaking down every fraudulent move they'd made with the precision of someone who had spent years in the trenches of the law. "This was not a mistake," he said, his voice cold. "This was a pattern of calculated deception. They knew what they were doing every step of the way." Dee sat back in her chair, her posture perfectly straight, watching as the damning details of their crimes unraveled. She didn't need to say a word. She had already done her part, and now it was time for them to face the consequence. When Ethan finished, the courtroom fell silent for a long moment, the weight of the evidence hanging heavy in the air. The judge looked up, his expression unreadable as he turned his gaze to the defendant. Kyle shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his arrogance starting to crack under the weight of the charges. Megan, her face flushed with a mixture of fear and disbelief, shifted in her chair, her eyes darting back and forth as if looking for an escape. It was then that Dee stood. Her movement was slow and deliberate, every step measured. She approached the stand, her heels clicking softly on the floor, and took her place in front of the judge. Her voice, when it came, was soft but firm, a stark contrast to the loud and frantic voices of Kyle and Megan. "I have spent my life working hard for what I have," Dee said, her eyes meeting the judge's. "I trusted my children, raised them, gave them everything I had, but they thought that money and deception could shield them from the truth." Her voice trembled for just a second before steadying. "Now, they are reaping what they have sown." She didn't look at Kyle or Megan as she spoke. She couldn't. She had already given them everything they needed. Now it was their turn to face the truth. Megan's sobs cut through the quiet courtroom like a blade. Her face was streaked with tears, her shoulders shaking with the force of her sobs. She had never known a world where money didn't fix everything, and now the weight of her choices was bearing down on her. Dee didn't feel pity. She had warned them. She had tried to protect them. But in the end, their greed had destroyed everything they had. The judge didn't react to her outburst. He simply looked at the documents again, his expression hardening with every passing second. Finally, the gavel came down with a loud crack. "This court finds the defendants guilty of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit financial theft." His voice was final, unyielding. "Civil penalties will be applied and restitution will be made to the victim, Dolores Carmichael. Sentencing will follow." The room erupted into a murmur, but Dee remained still, her heart steady. This was only the beginning of their punishment. The end wasn't here yet. As Kyle and Megan were led away, their faces a mixture of disbelief and humiliation, Dee remained calm. She had already won. The pieces were in place. There was no turning back now. Ethan's voice came to her ear, a quiet reassurance. "This is it, Dee. It's over." Dee nodded, her gaze following her children as they were escorted out of the courtroom. The storm had passed, but the wreckage of their arrogance would follow them for the rest of their lives. The letter came like a storm, not with the thunderous crash that might have shaken the walls, but with the quiet inevitability of an avalanche. Dee sat at the kitchen table, her fingers pressing against the edge of the envelope, feeling the weight of the official seal. She didn't need to open it. She already knew what it contained. The IRS was auditing the Jackpot filing. It had begun. Outside, the sun hung low over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the desert. Dee knew this moment was the turning point. It was the final step in a game she had been playing all along, silent, methodical, and unyielding. She didn't rush. Instead, Dee took a slow breath, her eyes steady. The wheels were already turning in the background. Ethan had filed everything, had ensured the IRS would see the discrepancies in Kyle and Megan's filing. They had tried to hide money, underreport income, set up secret accounts. They thought they could slip through the cracks of the law, that their wealth would keep them safe. But Dee had been waiting for this. She had been waiting for them to slip, waiting for the moment when everything they had built on lies and deception would fall apart. As the audit began, the world Kyle and Megan had carefully constructed around their lottery winning started to crumble. The IRS didn't miss a thing. Accounts that had once been secure were suddenly frozen, assets seized without warning. The lavish spending, the grandiose mansion, the cars, none of it mattered now. Kyle's phone buzzed incessantly. The emails and texts were pouring in, each one more frantic than the last. His bank accounts had been frozen. His credit cards were no longer valid. His every move was scrutinized. Megan sat across from him, her face pale, her hands trembling as she stared at the computer screen in front of her. The accounts, the funds, everything was gone. Every time they thought they could hide it, it was exposed. The luxury they had taken for granted was now a distant memory. The phone call from the IRS came next, a cold voice on the other end informing them that their mansion sale proceeds would be confiscated as part of the investigation. It was the final blow, the cherry on top of the disaster they had built. "What are we supposed to do now?" Megan asked, her voice breaking as she wiped her eyes. She had never known a world where money didn't fix everything, where privilege didn't shield her from consequence. But now, there was nothing left for her to hide behind. Kyle, his face flushed with rage, slammed his fist on the table. "We'll fight this. They can't do this. We earned that money. Every damn cent of it." His voice cracked, but he didn't care. He would keep fighting, keep pushing, as if his arrogance could stop the inevitable. But Dee knew better. She had watched this play out in her head 1,000 times. She had seen the signs, the cracks in their facade, and now they were exposed. There was no escape. There was no running from the truth. Across the street, in Dee's quiet home, Rita sat back in her chair, the corners of her lips curling with satisfaction. "The IRS doesn't miss much," she remarked, her eyes flicking to Dee. "They're thorough. And now, well, now they're paying the price for thinking they were above it all." Dee's lips curled into a faint smile, but her expression remained calm. "It's not a curse," she said softly. "It's Dee. I knew how this would play out. They were never untouchable. They were just too arrogant to see it." Rita chuckled softly. "Well, if anyone knows how to bring down a house of cards, it's you." Dee didn't respond. Her focus was on the bigger picture, the way everything was unfolding exactly as she had planned. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about accountability. It was about making sure they understood the cost of their greed. Outside, the news began to spread like wildfire. The community that had once envied Kyle and Megan's wealth, their flashy lifestyle, now whispered behind closed doors. "It's the lottery curse," one neighbor said, her voice low and full of schadenfreude. Others nodded in agreement, but Dee knew the truth. It wasn't the lottery that had cursed them. It was their own hubris. It was the lies they had lived by, and the way they had thought the world would bend to their will. Rita, who had been watching the neighborhood with a glint of amusement in her eyes, turned to Dee. "Let them call it a curse," she said, her voice quiet but filled with dark humor. "It's the best kind of irony." Dee stood, her eyes drifting to the front door. Kyle and Megan's downfall had been set into motion long ago. They just hadn't known it yet. She knew there would be more to come, more revelation, more cracks in their carefully constructed world. The IRS audit was just the beginning. As the sun set over the desert, Dee's mind was already focused on the next move. The end was close, but the price of their greed would be paid in full, and Dee would be there to see it all come to fruition. She took one last look at the neighborhood, her gaze steady. The storm was coming, and nothing would stop it now. The Leon notices came one after another, as cold and unyielding as the desert wind. Kyle and Megan had tried to fight, tried to hold on to what little they thought was theirs, but it was no use. The IRS had caught up with them, and now their empire was crumbling in front of their eyes. Dee sat in her modest home, the sun casting a warm glow through the window, but it did little to ease the weight of the moment. This was the final act, the endgame. The final line of defense was gone. The IRS had wiped out the remainder of their jackpot winnings. Everything they had fought for, everything they had squandered, was gone. Megan's extravagant jewelry, once flaunted as symbols of wealth, were now put up for auction. The bidders, anonymous and disinterested, saw them only as objects, a means to an end. The pieces that had been so carefully chosen for their opulence now lay on a table, waiting to be sold for pennies on the dollar. The diamonds that had once sparkled so brightly in Megan's eyes now lay dim in comparison to the harsh reality of her failure. As the jewelry was carted away, the realization hit Megan harder than any of the fines or debts she had racked up. She stood in the middle of her empty house, staring at the spaces once filled with things she had prided herself on, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Kyle, in the next room, was talking to his lawyer on the phone, but even he couldn't hide the tightness in his voice, the uncertainty that gripped him now. The money had run dry. The empire was gone. Meanwhile, across town, Kyle's cars, the ones he had shown off so proudly, parked like trophies in his driveway, were being repossessed. A tow truck backed up to the curb, the whine of its engine like a final, fatal sigh. Each car was taken, one by one, a symbol of his self-importance being stripped away. His once pristine garage was now just another space to store the remnants of his former life, the cars replaced with empty space. He'd shouted at the repo men, at anyone who came near. But his voice held no weight anymore. He had no power, no control. The people who had once catered to his every whim now watched as he lost everything. Dee could hear the distant rumble of trucks in her mind, the sound of lives being dismantled, of the grandiose world that had once seemed invincible falling apart. She had known this day was coming. She had waited for it. And now, as the final pieces fell into place, she felt nothing but quiet satisfaction. Ethan's call came shortly after, his voice crisp and efficient, but laced with the satisfaction of a victory well earned. "The civil suit is finalized," he said, a note of finality in his words. "Everything's in order. The restitution goes to you. They won't be able to stop this." Dee nodded as if she had expected no less. "Good," she said softly. "Let them try. Let them fight. They've lost, and they won't get it back." She stood and walked to the window, her fingers brushing the curtains as she gazed out over the desert. The sun was starting to dip lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The stillness of the landscape almost too perfect. The calm before the storm, she thought. Dee turned back toward the kitchen, where Rita had been waiting with a knowing smile. Rita raised her coffee mug, eyes twinkling. "You've got them exactly where you want them," she said, pouring herself another cup. "They're done." Dee's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "They said I'd rot alone," she murmured, her voice low, full of something dark and unshakable. "Now they beg alone." She stood still for a moment, letting the weight of the words settle. The world, it seemed, was always eager to kick you when you were down, but the true power was in knowing when to rise again, when to claim what was rightfully yours. Megan had once laughed, a cruel, victorious laugh, when they had won the lottery. But now it was her turn to face the consequences of her arrogance. Kyle had once thought he was invincible, his wealth a shield from the world. But shields, Dee had learned, were only as strong as the lies behind them. Rita chuckled softly, the sound rich with satisfaction. "You've taken everything from them, Dee. Everything they thought they could own." Dee's gaze flicked toward the phone, where the auction results had started to trickle in. The money from Megan's jewelry was barely a drop in the ocean of their debts, but it wasn't about the money anymore. It had never been about the money. It was about power, about control, about making sure that Kyle and Megan knew exactly what it felt like to have it all taken away. Not in a day, not in an hour, but piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the hollow space they had once filled with lies. As Rita poured the celebratory coffee, Dee let herself savor the moment. This wasn't just the end of their story, it was the beginning of hers. The court ruling came swiftly, too swiftly for Kyle and Megan to make sense of. Their heads were still spinning from the auction, from the freezing of their accounts, from the repossession of their cars and jewelry. But this final judgment, was different. This time, there was no fight left. The debt was too much, the lies too deep. They had lost, and the result was bankruptcy. Kyle sat hunched over a table in the sterile bankruptcy office, the papers in front of him a heavy weight on his chest. His suit, once immaculately pressed, now hung off him like a ragged reminder of everything he had lost. His fingers trembled as they sifted through the papers, but there was nothing left to do. Nothing he could say to undo what had been done. Megan sat beside him, her face pale, her eyes wide and empty. The woman who had once dazzled the world with her designer clothes and oversized smiles now looked hollow, defeated. Her fingers hovered over the final bankruptcy document, the weight of her signature so much heavier than it had ever been. She thought she could escape the consequences, but they were here now, unavoidable. They had once been gods of their own universe, their lives a continuous celebration of wealth and entitlement. Now, their story had shifted. Public humiliation was their new narrative. The papers, once devoted to gossiping about their extravagant lifestyle, were now filled with scathing articles. Headlines like lottery winners now begging for bailouts and from riches to ruin blared from every front page, leaving Kyle and Megan no place to hide. Dee had always known the truth would come out. She had watched them build their house of cards from the very beginning, each lie stacking higher and higher until it finally toppled. She was the quiet observer, the one who saw their greed, their arrogance, and their failure long before they realized what was coming. But now, with every article printed, with every laugh behind their backs, Dee felt something cold and sweet stir inside her, the satisfaction of justice. Across town, in her own quiet home, Dee received the phone call she had been waiting for. Ethan's voice was efficient as always, but today, there was a note of satisfaction in his words. "The deed transfers are final," he said. "You're officially in control of their forfeited assets. It's all yours." Dee stood still for a moment, absorbing the weight of the words. The assets? Everything they had once flaunted. Kyle and Megan's mansion, their cars, their stolen fortune, were now hers. She had outlasted them. She had watched their empire crumble and now stood at the pinnacle of their ruin, not with bitterness, but with quiet resolve. She glanced over at Rita, who was sitting across the room, a knowing grin spreading across her face. "From Jackpot to Junk Heap in 2 weeks," Rita said, her voice tinged with dark amusement. Dee let out a soft chuckle, the sound barely more than a whisper. They thought they could play the game better than anyone, but they couldn't see the moves ahead of them. Rita raised an eyebrow, a glint in her eye. "And now, everything they built is yours. All the things they thought they could steal from you. All the things they thought they deserved. Gone." Dee turned back toward the window, her gaze sweeping across the desert landscape. The calm was deceptive. There was a storm that had passed, and the wreckage of Kyle and Megan's former lives lay scattered in its wake. "I didn't want any of this," Dee said quietly. "I just wanted them to face what they'd done. I wanted them to see the truth." Rita stood and walked over to Dee, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're not the one who did this, Dee. They are. They made the choices that led them here. You just watched. And you waited. And now they're the ones who have to answer for it all." Dee didn't respond immediately, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. She could see it all, the way everything had unraveled, each move calculated to bring them to this moment. She had never been a woman to scream for justice or revenge. She had never needed to. But in the quiet satisfaction of her victory, she felt a deep sense of peace. Kyle and Megan, once so sure they could outrun the consequences, had tried to cheat the system. They had thought their money would save them, but they had only dug their own grave. And Dee had made sure they were buried in it. The sun was setting over the desert, the sky painted with hues of gold and orange. Dee stood there for a moment longer, savoring the silence before she spoke again. "Let them see how the game ends for those who think they can cheat," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. "Let them see how it feels to lose everything." With a deep breath, she turned away from the window. There was still more to be done, but the battle was already won. Kyle and Megan had lost. And Dee? She was just getting started. The courtroom was cold, but it wasn't the kind of chill that came from the air conditioning. This was a different kind of cold, the kind that settled deep into the bone, a stillness that hung in the air as the final judgment was read. Dee sat still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her back straight as she waited for the moment she had been anticipating for so long. Kyle and Megan, on the other hand, couldn't sit still. Kyle's hands clenched the sides of his chair, his jaw tight, as though he could will the outcome to be different. His eyes burned with fury, but there was no escaping what was about to happen. His pride, his arrogance, it all lay in pieces at his feet now. Megan sat beside him, her face pale and streaked with tears, her fingers trembling on the papers she barely grasped. She knew what was coming, and yet, she still couldn't comprehend it. How had it gone so wrong? How had they lost everything so quickly? Dee didn't flinch. She didn't let their desperation affect her. She had known, for months now, that this moment would come. The restitution was hers. She had outlasted them. And soon, every asset they had fought so hard to claim would be rerouted to her. Everything that once belonged to them, money, property, the mansion they had flaunted so carelessly, would now be hers. The judge, an older man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, scanned the final documents one last time. There was no drama, no spectacle. It was a simple formality. The evidence was overwhelming. The forgeries, the fraudulent loans, the accounts they had hidden, all of it was laid bare for the world to see. The judge, without hesitation, looked up from the paperwork. "Based on the clear evidence presented, I hereby rule that Dolores Carmichael is the rightful recipient of restitution for the damages incurred," the judge said, his voice steady but final. "Every remaining asset that once belonged to the defendants will be rerouted to her." He glanced at Kyle and Megan, and his expression softened only slightly, the cold, businesslike tone never leaving his voice. Their debts have been wiped clean, but that is all they will have left. Dee's heart didn't race. She didn't need it to. She simply nodded, her face still a mask of calm. But there was something deep inside her, a quiet triumph that had been brewing for so long now that it was almost second nature. She hadn't just won. She had outlasted them. She had taken back what was rightfully hers. Kyle stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, his fists slamming down on the table. The sound echoed through the room, drawing the attention of everyone present. "She stole my millions!" he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "She's taking everything from me. It's not fair. I worked for that money." His voice cracked with the weight of his emotions, the fury and the fear mixing together. Megan, who had been silent until now, looked up at him with wide eyes, but she said nothing. She had no words left. Dee didn't even look at him. She didn't need to. The truth was there for everyone to see, and it was all over for them. The judge, who had remained unmoved by the outburst, finally spoke. "You stole her name, Mr. Carmichael. You stole her identity, her trust, and now you sit here accusing her of stealing your money?" His voice was sharp, his tone as cutting as the gavel that came down moments later. "Enough." Kyle's face went red with humiliation, his mouth opening and closing as if he were trying to form words but couldn't find them. There was nothing left to say. The truth was final, and the gavel's fall signaled the end of his fight. Dee, however, didn't look at Kyle or Megan. Her gaze remained fixed ahead, her mind already calculating the next step. She had made sure they could do nothing more to hinder her. There was no escape for them anymore. Ethan, who had been sitting at the table beside Dee, stood as the judge declared the verdict. His voice was smooth, a reflection of the calm that had defined him throughout the proceeding. "The deed transfers are in process," he said, turning toward Dee. "Everything will be moved into your name. Their assets, liquidated, their debts settled. The rest, now legally yours?" Dee nodded. "Thank you," she said softly. She didn't need to say much. The victory was already complete. Everything they had taken from her was now hers again. Megan, unable to bear the weight of the humiliation any longer, buried her face in her hands. Her sobs echoed in the courtroom, but it was too late. Her tears wouldn't change anything. Kyle's anger still bubbled under the surface, but now it was nothing more than an impotent flare of emotion. He was defeated. The system had caught up with him. His world had fallen apart. Dee stood, the finality of the moment settling in her bones like a weight lifting from her chest. As she walked toward the exit, she glanced one last time at Kyle and Megan, the faces of her former children, her once beloved, now defeated heirs. They had believed they were untouchable, but she had shown them otherwise. The door to the courtroom swung open, and Dee walked through, her step steady, her heart calm. The world beyond awaited her, and in that moment, she felt more alive than she ever had before. She had reclaimed her life, and now she would make sure no one ever took it from her again. The finality of the moment was almost surreal. Dee sat in her lawyer's office, the papers in front of her, the weight of the jackpot she had claimed now officially her own. The last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. The majority of the $40 million jackpot, obtained through the restitution from Kyle and Megan's fraud, was now hers. Ethan, ever the professional, handed her the final document, the seal of approval from the IRS, confirming that everything had been cleared and processed. The government, with its meticulous scrutiny, had deemed Dee's filings flawless. There was no question left. The fraudulent shell company, the forged document, and all the lies, they had been exposed, and now the fruits of that deception were being rightfully handed to Dee. She signed the document with a calm hand, but inside, something shifted. It wasn't just the money. It was the power, the control, the feeling of watching Kyle and Megan crumble under the weight of their own mistakes, of their unchecked greed. "Everything's in order," Ethan said, as he filed away the last of the document. He looked at Dee, his face showing a rare hint of admiration. "You did it. You've taken everything from them." Dee didn't respond immediately. Her gaze was focused on the window, on the expanse of desert stretching out beyond. The weight of the sun beating down outside seemed almost fitting. There was no hiding from the truth now, not for anyone. She hadn't gambled. She hadn't relied on luck. Dee had calculated every move. She had studied their weaknesses, watched them as they played their hands, waiting for the right moment to strike. And when that moment came, she had pounced, cold, precise, and relentless. "The IRS leaves me untouched," Dee said, her voice steady. "All filings flawless. No questions, no complication." Ethan nodded, smiling slightly. "Not even a hint of suspicion. Your paperwork was airtight." Dee took in a slow breath, the realization settling in. The money was hers, the mansion, the luxury cars. Everything they had once flaunted as their victory had been stripped from them, piece by piece. Across town, Megan and Kyle were left with nothing but the shattered remnants of their former lives. The world they had once owned with their arrogant, their showy displays of wealth, had now evaporated into nothing. The public was ruthless in its scorn. The media had had a field day, reporting on their downfall with gleeful abandon. They were nothing but a cautionary tale now, examples of how greed, arrogance, and deceit had led them to ruin. Dee's phone buzzed. It was a message from Rita, always one step ahead, always aware of the state of things before anyone else. 40 million. Yours in 2 weeks. Dee read the message silently, letting the words wash over her. The victory was complete. The wealth that had once been theirs now belonged to her. Not just because of luck, but because she had outsmarted them, played the long game while they had rushed to the finish line, blind to the consequences. 2 weeks, Rita had said. And she was right. 2 weeks was all it had taken. In that time, Dee had watched them fall, their empire reduced to rubble, their reputations destroyed. Kyle, once so sure of himself, now sat in the ruins of his own creation, while Megan, the girl who had once shown off her wealth as though it was invincible, now cowered under the weight of her own collapse. Dee let out a breath. She had no need for their money, not in the way they had. It was never about the material wealth. It was about the justice, about showing them, about showing the world that power and privilege could be undone. As she sat there, the enormity of what she had done washed over her again, like a tidal wave. Kyle and Megan had never seen her coming. They had underestimated her. And now, everything they had built was in her name. She glanced over at Ethan, a slight smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. "Irony served cold," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. Ethan raised an eyebrow but smiled, a hint of approval in his eyes. "It's a beautiful thing." Dee stood and walked to the window, her eyes gazing out over the desert once more. The world was wide, and she felt small within it, but in that smallness was a strength, a quiet assurance that she had earned every step she had taken to get here. Her fingers grazed the cold glass, and for a moment she allowed herself to savor the quiet. The storm had passed. There would be no more running, no more hiding. Dee had reclaimed everything, and no one would ever take it from her again. "I didn't gamble," Dee whispered to herself, her voice soft, as if she were finally allowing herself the truth of it all. "I calculated. The jackpot wasn't just money, it was everything she had fought for. And now, it was hers. Finally, completely hers." Dee stood before the crowd, the soft hum of the local ceremony buzzing in the background. The warm sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the faces of the younger families who had gathered to honor her. She looked out over the crowd, feeling a strange mix of pride and serenity. This was her victory. Not just the money, not just the reclamation of what was once stolen, but the ability to make something meaningful out of it all. Her fingers brushed the edge of the podium as she prepared to speak, the weight of the moment settling into her bone. She had never been one for public displays, for grand gestures. Her life had been about quiet calculation, about moving in the background and watching the world unfold at her pace. But now, the world was watching her, and she had earned that attention. Dee had taken the restitution from the jackpot and turned it into something lasting. She had invested it into scholarships for young families, for those who had always struggled to make ends meet, for those who didn't have the opportunities she had once fought for. It wasn't about the wealth anymore. It was about changing lives. It was about ensuring that those who came after her didn't have to play the same brutal game she had. As she spoke to the crowd, Dee could feel the eyes of the younger families on families that had been struggling, families that had faced hardship but still dreamed of something more. The scholarships were more than just financial assistance. They were a lifeline. They were the chance for someone else to rise from the ashes of their circumstances, just as Dee had risen from her own. Every day, we have the chance to make a difference. Dee's voice rang out, steady and strong, to give someone the opportunity they might not have had otherwise. It's not about revenge. It's about redemption. It's about creating a future that's brighter for those who come after us. The applause was warm, genuine, and for the first time in years, Dee felt that strange weight lift off her chest. She hadn't done this for anyone's approval. But hearing the gratitude in their applause felt like the final affirmation that she had done the right thing. Rita stood off to the side, beaming with pride. Her eyes sparkled with that knowing gleam, the kind of look that only someone who had seen it all could possess. Rita had been by Dee's side throughout this journey, the one who had encouraged her to take action when it seemed impossible, the one who had stood firm even when Dee doubted herself. As Dee finished her speech, Rita approached, her arms crossed with that trademark smirk. 40 million in this. You're changing everything, Rita remarked, a glint of mischief dancing in her eyes. They should have known not to underestimate you. Dee smiled faintly, her gaze lingering on the crowd. They underestimated a lot of things. Ethan, who had been standing near the back, stepped forward, a clipboard in his hand. He had been instrumental in securing the scholarship fund, his meticulous nature ensuring that every legal aspect was flawless. As the applause died down, he cleared his throat and stepped to the microphone. I would like to take a moment to nominate Dolores Carmichael for the Community Leadership Award, Ethan announced. Her work has already changed lives, and her generosity will continue to impact this community for years to come. Dee's chest tightened at the sound of her name being announced so formally. She had never expected this, never wanted it, but the words felt different. They felt deserved. She had rebuilt her life, yes, but this was something greater. It was a legacy she had never anticipated. The applause was deafening now. The community had accepted her not just as a victim of circumstances, but as someone who had risen to make a real difference. As Dee stepped down from the podium, she couldn't help but glance at the far end of the parking lot. There, among the scattered cars and onlookers, she saw Kyle. He was standing alone, wearing a faded jacket, the same bitterness etched into his features that she had once known so well. His eyes locked on hers for a brief moment, and she could see the anger still burning in him. The world had turned against him, and it had come full circle. He was a shadow of the man he used to be. The arrogance had drained from him, replaced by something darker. He had been left with nothing. No mansion, no cars, no reputation. The very essence of his self-worth had vanished, and it had all been because of the choices he had made. Dee didn't stop to confront him. There was nothing left to say. Kyle's presence was just another symbol of what greed could do to a person when they thought they were untouchable. Megan, on the other hand, had vanished. She had moved away, the remnants of her once glamorous life scattered behind her. The shame of her collapse had been too much for her to bear. Dee had never seen Megan in person again after the trial, and she never would. Megan had slinked away, hiding from the world she had tried to conquer. She had been erased too soon. Her former beauty and her pride swept away in the tide of her own decision. Dee walked away from the crowd, her head held high. She had done what she set out to do. She had turned the darkest moments of her life into a beacon for others. She hadn't needed to watch Kyle's despair, nor did she need to see Megan's shame. What mattered now was what she had built from the ashes. Dee had won. The community had a new future because of her. And no one, especially not Kyle or Megan, could ever take that from her. Dee sat on the desert overlook, the vast expanse of the landscape stretching out before her. The sun had dipped low, painting the sky with shades of crimson and gold, the horizon a perfect blend of fire and fading light. She had always found peace here, sitting quietly at the edge of the world, the weight of her past and present dissolving with the setting sun. It was a place she had visited for years, a place where she could just be. No expectations, no noise, just the quiet hum of the earth beneath her. Tonight, though, the peace felt different. It wasn't just the quiet of the desert or the serenity of the moment. It was the sense of completion. She had fought for so long, for so many things, and now everything had fallen into place. Rita approached, her steps soft against the sand, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She handed one to Dee, her eyes twinkling as she settled beside her on the worn stone bench. "You've earned this moment," Rita said, a knowing smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Dee took the glass, the coolness of the tea offering a welcome contrast to the warmth of the evening. She nodded, savoring the stillness. "It's been a long time coming." Rita took a sip of her own tea, her gaze following Dee's to the horizon. "And now, everything you've worked for is yours. They never saw you come." Dee didn't respond right away, her eyes tracing the last rays of sunlight as they danced over the desert land. Everything had been taken from her, but now, she had reclaimed it all, with interest. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. She pulled it from her pocket, her fingers already knowing it was Ethan. She answered, her voice calm, like the moment itself. "It's done," Ethan said, his voice smooth, carrying the weight of finality. "The case is closed. The jackpot is secured. No further challenges." Dee closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. The years of struggle, the quiet hurt of betrayal. It was over now. The money, the mansion, the life she had lost and now regained. It was all finally hers, completely, legally. No more threats, no more games. She had done what she set out to do. "Thank you, Ethan," Dee said softly, her voice almost a whisper. This is all I ever wanted. You earned it," he replied. "I'm glad I could help." She ended the call, slipping the phone back into her pocket. For a moment she simply sat in silence, breathing in the stillness of the desert, the weight of the sunset settling around her like a warm, protective cloak. Rita shifted beside her, glancing over with a knowing smile. "The money's yours. It's all in your account. Every penny. You've come full circle." Dee nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of her phone again. She opened the bank app, her heart steady as she saw the numbers on the screen. The total, 40 million, was everything. It was the fruit of years of planning, of watching, of learning, and now it was real. A soft chuckle escaped her lips as she stared at the screen. "It's real. It's all mine now." Rita grinned, tapping Dee's arm lightly. "And look at you, from lottery loser to fortune maker. The world doesn't see it yet, but they will. And when they do, they'll see what happens when you bet against me." Dee finished for her, her voice low but full of finality. "They thought I'd rot alone. They thought I'd disappear in the shadows. But I'm here. And now I have everything." Rita leaned back, sipping her tea with a slow grin. "You've earned the peace you fought for. No one can take that from you. Not now. Not ever." Dee took another sip of her tea, letting the coolness linger as the last of the sun dipped below the horizon. The world felt different now. The weight that had once pressed so hard on her shoulders was gone, and in its place was a quiet satisfaction. She stood up, her legs strong beneath her, her heart still calm. "It's funny," Dee said, looking back at Rita. "They always said money changes people, but I never changed. I just waited for my moment." Rita's eyes sparkled, a laugh bubbling in her throat. "And now? Now they've learned what happens when they underestimate." Dee smiled faintly, her gaze shifting to the quiet neighborhood below them. The wind stirred the sand, a reminder that life always moved forward, no matter who had tried to hold it back. As Dee turned to leave, her footsteps light but purposeful, she felt the weight of the past fall away completely. No one would ever take this from her. She had earned her place. She had done what was once thought impossible. As she reached the bottom of the hill and walked toward her home, she glanced at her phone one last time. The final comment on her blog flashed across the screen. "Your proof money doesn't change everyone, just the weak." Dee smiled to herself, a small, satisfied smile. "My kids split $40 million and told me, 'Go rot alone.' But 2 weeks later, I owned every penny." She didn't need to say more. The world had already seen the truth.